Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Joanne Scott, Senior Project Manager at the External Reporting Board, also known as the NZASB, and I'll be hosting this session. We're running 2 webinars this morning. Both webinars are about recent exposure drafts issued by the New Zealand Accounting Standards Board, which is a sub-board of the NZASB. The first webinar is on service performance reporting, and it will run from now until around 10:30. On interests in other entities. That webinar will run from 11 till 12. So if you just want to listen to this webinar, that's fine, welcome, and we'll get onto that in a minute. If you have registered for both webinars, then you should have received 2 invitations, each containing a link to the webinar. Once this webinar finishes, you'll need to activate the link for the other webinar. We're happy to receive your questions throughout the sessions, and we'll respond to as many as we can at the end of the session. So, welcome to this webinar on service performance reporting. Today we're looking at an ED, an exposure draft of a proposed standard on service performance reporting, and this ED was issued in February this year. So it was issued by the NZASB. And the NZASB is currently seeking feedback on the proposals in the ED. The comment period's open until 30th of June, and really one of the main sessions of this session, one of the main purposes, is to provide you an overview of the ED and to encourage you to provide feedback to the board. At the end of the webinar, we'll also have a quick look at the new PBE Conceptual Framework, because it is the board had reference to that new framework when it was developing this exposure draft. So that conceptual framework was issued last month. So let's move on to the first slide, which considers why the NZASB decided to develop a PBE standard on service performance reporting for Tier 1 and 2 PBEs. That was a mouthful. Okay. Just before we start talking about the project and the ED, I know some of you have been emailing to check what's available on the website about this webinar and the ED. On our website, you will find the exposure draft together with the invitation to comment, which contains the discussion of the things the board considered in putting the exposure draft together, and contains the questions on which they're seeking feedback. There's also an in-summary document on our website, which again just provides an overview of the key proposals. And this session is being recorded, so that if you want to come back to it again, or encourage friends to catch up with it, then it will be available on the website. So let's talk about this project. Why did the NZASB decide to undertake this project? The short answer is that there's a gap in the standards. We have PBE standards on a range of financial reporting standards, but at the moment we don't have any standards level requirements for Tier 1 and 2 PBEs on service performance reporting. And that's not to say that people aren't doing service performance reporting, it's just saying we don't have a standard on it. Some entities have been doing service performance reporting for years. In the public sector, some entities have had legislative requirements for at least the last 20 years. In the not-for-profit sector, many entities are voluntarily providing information about their service performance. However, we haven't had a standard. Just to recap on the comment period, sorry, I said the 30th of June, it should have been the 29th of July. 30th of June is the comment period for the other ED that we're looking at this morning. So coming back to this project, we have a gap in the standards. Was it a critical gap? The NZASB felt that it was. So we're not trying to reinvent the world here. The board's objective was to develop a standard that could sit within our suite of PBE standards and that would provide high-level guidance to enable people to put together their service performance information and allow it to sit alongside their financial statements in a general purpose report. So let's have a quick look at the primary objective of PBEs. So we're talking about the set of PBE standards, and the key thing that has really been the driver for this project is that objective. So the primary objective of PBEs is to provide goods or services for community or social benefit. Obviously, if you're providing goods or services for community or social benefit, you've got objectives that are much broader than financial objectives. So there's a need in your general purpose reporting to tell people not only about your financial performance, but also about your service performance. The board also sat back and thought about the purpose of general purpose financial reports, and this is where it looked closely at what the new conceptual framework says for PBEs. And that framework talks about providing information to users for accountability and decision making. And when you look at the front section of the exposure draft, you'll see that there's a whole section devoted to accountability and decision making and how service performance reporting supports those objectives. So if the objectives of general purpose financial reports is about accountability and decision making, and service performance reporting information is essential to meet those objectives, then the NZASB concluded that in order to meet the objectives of general purpose financial reports, that it should have standards in place for both financial statements and service performance information. I've got a bullet point there about there's currently more emphasis on telling your story. Some of you will use that phrase yourself. That phrase, telling your story, is also used in the Tier 3 and 4 standards. It's just acknowledging that people do provide a lot more information about their activities, and they're trying to get people to understand what they're doing, why they're doing it. We do have a standard which has a tiny bit of guidance on service performance reporting at the moment, but it's not really enough. So PBE IPSAS 1, and the title of that standard is Presentation of Financial Statements. It currently contains a very small requirement for entities that already choose to, or are required to prepare statements of service performance, but that's a very limited requirement. There's also an appendix of non-integral guidance which accompanies PBE IPSAS 1, and that non-integral guidance, it's got some useful material in it, but it was originally written a long time ago and it was never really intended to form part of a standard. At this point, I'll just point out that one of the changes that is being proposed alongside this exposure draft is to change the title of PBE IPSAS 1 and to Presentation of Financial Reports, and to make it clear within PBE IPSAS 1 when it's referring to both components of a financial report and when it's referring solely to financial statements or solely to service performance information. So that's quite a fundamental change that's being proposed to PBE IPSAS 1, and you might like to look at the proposed changes which are set out in an appendix to the exposure draft. Another reason for the board undertaking this project, or a reason for it being good timing, was that the Australian Accounting Standards Board, that's the NZASB, and the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board, or the NZASB, both of those boards also had projects underway on service performance reporting, so it was a good time to be considering the work of other standard setters. In the case of the Australian Accounting Standards Board, they issued an exposure draft last year, and they then extended the comment period till about the end of April this year. And they will also, they're still to deliberate on all their feedback, and they will also be interested in the feedback received in New Zealand from New Zealand constituents. If you pick up the Australian ED and have a look at it, you'll find that there's a lot of similarities. And there's a reason for that. It's that we, at a staff level, we did work closely together in developing the initial drafts of the EDs. But for reasons of differences between the jurisdictions and different views between the boards, there are a few differences, but there are a lot of things that are the same as well. The NZASB, the International Board, with their project, they weren't trying to develop a standard, they were developing guidance, and their document is called Recommended Practice Guidance 3, RPG 3, and that guidance was issued about a year ago, and it is available on the NZASB's website. Okay, so this project has been a few years in the making, and that indicates that the board took its time to think through and debate the proposals and to talk to other people. But it also indicates that this is a project where it's particularly important, where we receive your comments. So at this point, let's have a quick discussion about the scope proposals in the ED. Normally in our PBE standards, the scope section says that it applies to all Tier 1 and 2 PBEs that have these particular types of transactions or events. In this case, the scope is slightly different. We have different scope requirements for not-for-profit PBEs and public sector PBEs. The proposal in the ED is that all not-for-profit entities are required to comply with the proposals in the ED, but that in the case of public sector PBEs, the paragraph refers to public sector PBEs required by legislation to present a statement of service performance information by whatever name called. So we have a difference between them. There are obviously some public sector PBEs that would not fall within the scope as proposed. How come? Why did the board get to this position? The main reason is that in the absence of a standard, an accounting standard on this issue, we've had Parliament establishing requirements for various types of public sector PBEs over the years. So there are different types of requirements for different types of public sector PBEs. And some of those requirements require that entities provide service performance information to which you could easily apply the proposals in the ED. But in other cases, Parliament has decided that because of the nature of the entity or for certain cost-benefit reasons, that some entities are not required to prepare service performance information. So there are reasons for the differing requirements that have been established, and at this point the NZASB decided that it wasn't appropriate for it to question Parliament's intentions in establishing those requirements. So the scope that is proposed in the ED is consistent with the scope that is currently in the service performance sections in the Tier 3 and 4 simple format reporting standards. That's not to say that entities that fall outside the scope, if they chose to present service performance information, then they could voluntarily apply the proposals in the ED. So that is an issue on which the board is seeking your feedback. I mentioned before that at the front of the ED there's a section about accountability and decision making, and here I've referred to that really as the principles underlying the ED. We don't normally have a whole section that's kind of chatty about principles at the start of a standard. Normally in a standard you might have an objective paragraph, the scope, and then you're into the requirements. In this case we do have quite a long introductory section that talks about the importance of service performance information and some of the factors that you have to consider in deciding what to report. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Service performance reporting requires a lot of judgment, and I'm sure I'm speaking to the converted here, you know this better than me. Therefore, when you've got a lot of judgment calls to make, the concepts in the conceptual framework become even more important than usual. So normally standard setters have regard to the conceptual framework when they're developing standards, but then they establish requirements and just put those requirements in the standards. In this case, the board felt that it was important to draw the links between the proposals in the ED and what's in the conceptual framework for readers. The other reason that the board wanted to have that introductory section about accountability and decision making is that often the people that are responsible for preparing service performance information are not accountants. And although we'd expect accountants to be aware of what's in the conceptual framework, it's a bit of an ask to expect other people to be aware of all of those concepts. Okay, so just looking at the bullet points that we've got on the slides here, what are some of the things that introductory section talks about? It talks about meeting the information needs of users of general purpose financial reports. It talks about service performance information should be useful for accountability and decision making, so we've already talked about that quite a bit. Then it talks about the fact that people preparing service performance information need to consider the qualitative characteristics and the pervasive constraints. Now, if you're an accountant, you'll probably think, yes, I do know what those things are. They're lurking in the conceptual framework. But if you're a non-accountant, you might want some help here. So what are the qualitative characteristics? They're things like relevance, faithful representation, understandability, timeliness, comparability, and verifiability. And to put this in context, when you're preparing service performance information, you do have to make some serious judgment calls about what is the most relevant information, and if your information has to be audited, then you'll also be quite interested in, is it verifiable? And sometimes you might have things that are high on relevance, but difficult to verify. Other times you might have things that are very easy to verify, but perhaps not so relevant. So you're often making judgment calls there. The pervasive constraints are materiality, cost-benefit, and balance between the qualitative characteristics. Materiality flows through all of our standards, or is an underlying theme in all of the standards. Cost-benefit also becomes important in this area. For entities that have been preparing service performance information for a number of years, then they will have gradually developed their information sets for presenting service performance information. They will have developed performance measures and refined them over time. For entities that are starting out, there are serious cost-benefit issues to consider, and it may be that you start off small and gradually increase the amount of information or the nature of methods that you use to gather information. Okay. The final bullet point on the slide says that the ED suggests that an entity should aim to provide appropriate and meaningful information. So let's consider that for a minute. It's a new phrase. It isn't in any other standards. Why is it in this ED, and do you think that it helps? The board wasn't trying to establish a new requirement by inserting that phrase in the document, but the board was aware that often, sure, you've got the conceptual framework and those qualitative characteristics, but when people are debating what information they should put in their report and what they should highlight, or whether there are any activities that they could leave out, the board felt that it might be useful for people to have a phrase that tries to draw together all of those considerations. So that phrase, appropriate and meaningful, was intended to be a helpful phrase to help people when they're having discussions about the selection and presentation of information. But if it's not helpful, then the board would like to know. So it was to help people stand back and reflect on the usefulness of the information as a whole. So that's probably enough on that section in the ED that talks about accountability and decision making. Let's move on now to the dimensions of service performance. And we've got a diagram here, but I'd like to start off by saying you can love it or hate it. I mean, we've had mixed views about this, and it really doesn't matter too much. whether you agree with the way this diagram's laid out. The key question is, what are the dimensions of service performance that the board identified and put in the ED, and do you agree with those dimensions and what the board is proposing the entities report about those dimensions? So let's start off with, what did the entity do? And these questions are similar to the types of questions that are used in the Tier 3 and 4 simple reporting format standards. So the board didn't start off from scratch. It was trying to be consistent with those standards as well. Also, if you pick up the performance reports of some entities, you'll find that they're actually reporting under those headings already. Okay. So the first dimension is, what did the entity do? And the ED proposes that entities report on this dimension by providing information about outputs. And in the past, most of the service performance reporting requirements that we've got in PBE NZASB 1 do focus on outputs, because that is where many entities began their service performance reporting journey. The second dimension of service performance that is identified in the ED is, why did the entity do it? And the ED proposes that entities report on this dimension by providing information about the outcomes that the entity is seeking to influence and how those outputs contribute, how its outputs contribute to those outcomes. And I think the ED doesn't set up any requirements about what sort of model you have for you looking to change things, but it is based on the assumption that you have some sort of logic model or performance framework underlying your service performance reporting. So the ED is not proposing to establish any requirements about the model or reporting all the details of what model you operate from. But what it is saying is that as a PBE, you're obviously providing some goods and services. So why are you providing those goods and services? What's your ultimate aim? The board was aware that when you're talking about outcomes, you can have a spectrum of outcomes, ranging from the ones that you might refer to as intermediate outcomes that can be easier to identify where you're having a change, or there may be some that are quite aspirational, long-term and way out there in the future where it's difficult to see whether you're having any impact on those outcomes. So what the board did in establishing this third dimension is it decided that the dimension should be referred to as, what impact did the entity have? And I'm aware that some groups use the word impact in different ways, but just let's talk about how the board's thought about it in the CD. And it says that an entity reports on impact or reports on this dimension by providing information about the extent to which it has evidence of its influence on the groups or environments that it's seeking to change. And that wording was quite carefully crafted, and it took quite a long time to get to. It's not saying that everybody will have evidence of all of their impacts. It's saying that you report on that dimension by providing information about the extent to which you have evidence of your influence. So the board did try and be realistic about the fact that we have various types of entities that would be applying this proposed PBE. There's quite a big range in the size of entities, there's quite a big range in what entities do, and there's also a big range in experience in service performance reporting. So the board was trying to be reasonable about this. The board's starting position, really, in including all of these dimensions, was that it came to the view that all entities should be able to describe what they do and why they do it. However, it did spend a lot of time thinking about which entities should be required to report on their impact on outcomes, or evidence of their influence on outcomes. And again, the NZASB was aware that there are a range of entities that there are differing accountabilities between entities and the difficulties of measuring impacts. So the board, in establishing those requirements, it was tossing up between what it felt to be best practice, and that's what drove the requirement for all entities to report on impact. However, it did try and establish reasonable expectations about what entities will be able to report. And we'll talk about that a bit more in the next slide. So the balance of information, whether you report more at the output end or whether you report more at the outcome end, it's up to the entity to decide. And I guess one of the issues that the board would be interested in feedback on is it feasible to leave that judgment call to the entity? However, on the flip side, if you're suggesting to the board that that's a difficult judgment call to leave within a standard, it's also difficult for an external body such as the board to establish general requirements without leaving in some flexibility like that. So let's move on to the next slide, and in that slide we'll talk a bit more about how the board tried to address what I refer to as the reality check. Okay, so we've already talked about the three dimensions, and if I use some shorthand here and refer to them as outputs, outcomes sought, and impacts, I've highlighted the impacts because that was the area where the board had most debate. But I mean, we are receiving differing feedback from differing groups. I'm aware that for some not-for-profit entities that might not have tried to report on their impact before, that represents a challenge. However, another view is for some public sector entities that have been reporting on impacts for years, then they consider that their focus is more at that end of the spectrum and are less interested in providing much information on outputs. So there are a range of views out there. The board did acknowledge one size doesn't fit all. Entities will have to consider what their role is, what the nature of their accountability is, and they'll have to weigh up those qualitative characteristics and pervasive constraints. So recapping on those, entities will have to think about, for example, the relevance and verifiability of information and how easily they can obtain information. And it may be that entities develop their information gathering methods over time. The board did also acknowledge that some entities may be unable to provide impact information, and that is stated in the ED. So if an entity doesn't have any impact information or can't provide any impact information that satisfies the qualitative characteristics, then it would say that. So that's in paragraph 45 of the ED. So I'd encourage you to read through the ED and keep your eyes open for all the bits where the board has tried to be realistic about those difficulties that entities might face. So just to give you some examples of some of those paragraphs in the ED, paragraph 10C talks about reporting on impacts and says that an entity provides information on the extent to which it has evidence. So if if an entity doesn't have evidence, then it doesn't have evidence. Paragraphs 16 to 19 provide a bit of context about what the board's requiring. So it talks about different accountabilities and the fact that an entity's accountability will influence what it should report on. It talks about the difficulty of establishing causal relationships. You may know very well what you're trying to influence, but if environmental factors or the fact that you've got 20 other groups also trying to influence those things, that may make it difficult to establish the link between what you're doing and changes in demographics. The ED also acknowledges that you may be working with other entities. That's common across the sector, and that if you're working with other entities, you'll have to decide how you report upon those joint activities, whether you pull out the bits that you were primarily responsible for and acknowledge that it was done as part of a joint activity, or whether you refer more detail, if there is one, in a joint report. The board also acknowledges that in reporting on impact, entities may well choose to report on what it refers to as intermediate outcomes, the things that are closer to what you do, and we'll talk a bit more about those in a minute. So there's there are a number of bits and pieces throughout the standard that I'd encourage you to skim through and see if you can identify what I refer to as those reality checks. See if you think that the board's put in enough reality checks and if they've got the balance right. So that's another area that we would really value your feedback. Now the next few slides aren't really critical to the ED, but I've put them in just to illustrate the fact that entities can use different types of diagrams when they're explaining what they do, and to acknowledge that you can have many levels of outcomes, and in reporting on impacts it's up to the entity to decide which level of outcomes it has information about its impact. Okay, so outcomes often occur along a continuum. Some people choose to present them in diagrams such as the one that we're showing there and have various levels of intermediate outcomes. As I mentioned before, the ED doesn't get into saying how you set up your intervention model or your performance framework. That's your business, but it does assume that an entity has some theory about how what it does influences outcomes. So this ED is about external reporting. So your external reporting is the reports that you put your general purpose financial statements in. The proposal is that those general purpose financial reports also include a component on service performance reporting. And the reason that I've got these slides here is that the ED talks about giving the reader enough information to understand the links between the dimensions that are being reported. So if an entity is reporting on outputs and outcomes, then the reader needs to know a bit about the entity, what the entity thinks are. It's not suggesting that you need to provide the reader with all the information about your performance framework. It's just saying that you need to provide the reader with enough information to understand what you understand those links to be and how you're trying to demonstrate the links. So just to give some simplified examples, with guide dogs, if you're training guide dogs, then those are your outputs. You may also be doing mobility interventions or awareness and training. The outcome might be that you want people to be able to exercise choice and control in their lives, but you may have intermediate outcomes that are things like adults feel that they've got more choices about what they do, or about that they're able to carry out vital tasks in their lives. And how you measure those things, then you may be having surveys to see if people perceive that having equipment or guide dogs or training, that if they've improved their independence, possibly in relation to their travel or around their home. So it's up to the entity how it reports on those things. Moving on to the next slide again, this was just to illustrate that different entities present their outputs and outcomes in different ways. This example was drawn from a health sector entity, and it just shows some of the titles that they use for the different layers of outcomes. And some of you will work in areas where you actually have whole handbooks or discussion documents which talk about the levels of outcomes in your sector and the links between them, possible performance indicators. I mean, again, this ED isn't trying to get into any of that detail. It's really just trying to establish high-level principles about what could be reported in an external report. Again, the next slide is presenting one type of diagram that's often used by entities, and I've seen quite a few not-for-profit entities that are starting out with service performance, finding this a useful layout to explain what they do and what they're trying to influence. So that's one that layout there allows for entities to put narrative in the boxes, so that can be quite a useful starting point. Coming back to what's in the ED, there's some requirements in the exposure draft about performance indicators. And again, you can have whole handbooks for sectors about what are appropriate performance indicators and how you can collect information to report performance. The ED, again, keeps it pretty high level. It talks about performance indicators and it establishes some requirements, but it really leaves it up to the entity to select its performance indicators and whether it's going to report on targets for those indicators. So it refers to indicators as measures or descriptions used to communicate the achievement of service performance, and it establishes requirements in relation to performance indicators for outputs and impacts. If you read the ED, you'll see that it talks about an entity reporting performance indicators on outputs and using performance indicators to support the description of impacts on outcomes. So it's not suggesting that you'll have a few performance indicators that conclusively demonstrate your impact. It talks about performance indicators supporting your description of impact. It is very high-level guidance in the ED about the selection. It talks about the judgment that's needed to determine the most appropriate and meaningful indicators. It talks about providing an overall picture, which means that you have to focus on the key performance indicators. It talks again about those qualitative characteristics. So it goes back again and tries to link the selection of performance indicators to the underlying concepts in the conceptual framework. It does mention efficiency and effectiveness, but it doesn't establish any requirements about reporting on efficiency and effectiveness. So many entities will have performance indicators that do provide readers with information that they can use to assess the efficiency and effectiveness, but it doesn't define those terms and it doesn't establish requirements. And the reason is that for some entities, those things can be quite difficult to measure. So, and the other reason is that different people have different views about the exact definitions of those terms, and the board didn't really want to get into those debates. Yes, some of your performance indicators will help people assess your efficiency and effectiveness, and you'll probably want to provide indicators that help people make those assessments, but we don't need to get into debates about the definitions. Okay. The ED explains that there are a range of measures and descriptions that you can use. So it talks about the quantitative measures and gives examples of quantity, cost, time, and explains that you may have numerical targets. Quantitative measures are what the public sector started off with for outputs, and over time you'll find that entities tend to move into qualitative measures or qualitative descriptions. So it depends what you're doing, what you want to measure, and you may use a mixture of all three types. When you pick up reports where entities are currently reporting on their service performance information, quite often you'll see qualitative descriptions. So those participant observations, they can come from people explaining how participating in a course has changed their outlook or their opportunities. People sometimes use interviews, video clips. I'm not quite sure how you're going to link video clips to your external report, but I guess if you've got them available on your website, you can make links to them. Entities also make a lot of use of surveys, and there can be a variety of types of surveys. Sometimes people are interested in, were people aware that they existed? Were people aware of their services? Did people use their services? If so, what did they think of them? And in the case of entities providing advice, did entities actually use their advice? So there's quite a wide range of things happening out there. Let's move on to another section in the ED. The ED's got some requirements about presentation and comparatives. This is because it's intended to be an accounting standard that sits within a set of PBE standards, and it's also the service performance information is going to be sitting in an external report alongside the financial statements So there are a few requirements in there that are designed to help the reader make sense of the financial statements and the service performance information together. Although the slide's headed up presentation and comparatives, there's actually not much in the ED about presentation. There's no prescribed format. The ED talks about selecting the format that best meets user needs. So that allows quite a bit of flexibility there, and that's appropriate in this area. The ED does permit some cross-referencing to other documents, and the board was aware that, as I mentioned before, entities often work together to try and achieve things, so there can be a variety of relationships, and it may be that there is another report that has got a lot of detailed information about your service performance. So the ED is not requiring that you duplicate all that information and bring it across to your report. You are allowed to make cross-references to other reports where that's appropriate, but there are some minimum requirements in the proposals set out in the ED to provide some protection for users, that they're still getting an overview of what you've done, and that other information will remain available to them when they're looking at the financial statements, that they can access that other information. There are also some requirements about cross-referencing between the service performance information and the financial statements, so that if users, if you're providing information about the cost of output, say, that users can actually go back and see how that relates to the financial statements. The ED contains some proposed requirements about comparatives. They're pretty standard requirements, what you'd normally see in an accounting standard this year versus last year. However, the ED does acknowledge that entities will change, their activities will change over time, and from time to time entities will change the way that they want to report on the activity or the measures they select. So it does have some guidance on how you deal with those changes. Now, the next bullet point's a bit of a tongue twister. It reads, prospective versus actual only if previously published prospective. And so whoever wrote that needs their head read, but it was me. So what does it mean? All it means is that if you actually published your budgeted service performance information, if you made that available to the public in a general purpose report, then you have to report on it at the end of the year in your service performance information. Now, in the public sector, there are often legislative requirements to publish your budgeted or forecast service performance information, which means that those entities have to report on it in their end-of-year report. In the case of not-for-profit entities, most of them do not publish their planned service performance. Therefore, there is no requirement in the ED to report against it at the end of the year. So that's the same situation with your financial statements, and we've just taken it across and applied it to service performance information. The NZASB is suggesting that an implementation period between when the final standard is issued and when it becomes effective, that an implementation period of around 2 years might be appropriate, but the board is interested in your feedback on that. So for entities that haven't previously been reporting service performance information in their external reports, is that long enough for them to establish systems and collect data, and also to test data? So the next slide that we're looking at is about auditing and assurance, and the reason that we've included this slide is because people, when they're thinking about service performance information, often questions about audit and review spring to mind, because it can be an area where you need to be a bit careful about, if you're going to be subject to audit or review, that you can present information that is capable of being audited or reviewed. So if you are subject to audit and review, you do need to think about that a bit at the beginning of the period. The NZA, the sister body to the External Reporting Board's Accounting Standards Board. There's another sub-board called the Auditing and Assurance Standards Board, and they've issued an explanatory guide for Tier 3, so that's EG-AU9, and it's called Guidance on the Review or Audit of the Performance Report of Tier 3 Not-for-Profit Public Benefit Entities. So it's focused on Tier 3 because some Tier 3 entities are currently having to report in accordance with the Tier 3 Simple Format Reporting Standards, and which includes service performance requirements, and some of the Tier 3 entities are also subject to audit or review requirements. So that's an existing issue, and in the absence of a standard auditing standard on service performance reporting, that board issued the explanatory guide to help people. So even if you don't have a particularly strong auditing interest, I'd suggest that you have a quick look at that guidance. It sets out the current requirements for Tier 3 quite nicely, and also helps step people through some of the audit issues and where they look for requirements within the suite of auditing and assurance standards. That board, the Auditing and Assurance Standards Board, is also looking to develop an auditing standard, and that project's underway, but they're actually waiting until the accounting standard is finalised before firming up on their proposals, and they may look at developing a separate review standard in the future. So looking at the next steps for this exposure draft, comments are due by the 29th of July. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, if you're wanting to look more closely at these proposals or make a submission, then the documents are available on the NZASB website. So there's the invitation to comment and the exposure draft are on the website. There's also an in-summary document, which is a brief document just highlighting some of the proposals in the ED. If you're planning to make a submission, the invitation to comments is really the best place to start, because it sets out the background to this project, some of the key issues that the board considered, and it includes the questions that the board is specifically seeking feedback on. So if you're wanting to make a comment, please send your comments to us at that email address at submissions@nzab.govt.nz. Feel free to answer all or some of the questions, and we're happy if you do a formal submission or more informal comments in an email. Any feedback is welcome. I think this is, as I've tried to explain, this is a particularly important area for the board to receive feedback, because normally we're drawing upon international standards or the standards produced by other jurisdictions when we put out proposals for comment here. In this case, we're not. This is really much more homegrown. We have had regard to international proposals, but there's currently no international standard on service performance reporting. The equivalent guidance internationally is just guidance, and it was developed more for governments as a whole than for the broad PBE sector that we consider in New Zealand. Now, as part of this webinar, we do have a couple of slides on the conceptual framework, and the reason that we've included these slides is that the conceptual framework was only issued in May this year, but the board had put it out for comment last year, and in developing this exposure draft, the board did draw heavily on this framework. So unfortunately, it's farewell to the old framework and hello to the new framework. I don't know if I should say unfortunately or fortunately, it's goodbye to the old framework. The old PBE framework, it has served a useful purpose. I mean, it's critical to have a conceptual framework, but really that framework was initially developed for for-profit entities, and we'd had to patch it up and expand it a bit to make it appropriate for application by PBEs. So the new PBE conceptual framework is based on the NZASB's conceptual framework. So it was originally developed for public sector entities, but because so many of the issues are similar between the public sector and the not-for-profit sector, it considers service performance and the environment in which you operate in a much more integrated way. So if you pick up the PBE Conceptual Framework, it's a bit more of a seamless discussion. So when it talks about the objectives of public benefit entities, it does talk about service performance as well. So I think that you'll find that the new PBE Conceptual Framework is a much easier read, or a better read, than the old one for entities that are PBEs. The PBE Conceptual Framework still doesn't have a lot about service performance reporting, but it does refer to the elements of service performance reporting, and it does refer to service performance reporting when it discusses the objectives of reporting, and it also refers to service performance reporting in the chapter on presentation. So what do you find in the new PBE Conceptual Framework? Pretty much the same things that you'd expect to find, that we've had in our old frameworks, and they're fairly standard topics. The key characteristics of PBEs, that's a new section, which is really like an explanatory foreword. It just talks about the characteristics of the entities that will be applying this framework, or the characteristics of entities that the NZASB has in mind when it's developing standards, and how some of those characteristics can influence what's proposed in standards. There's a section on objectives, which I've referred to, and that integrates both service performance reporting and financial reporting. There's a chapter on the users. The users that it talks about are resource providers and service recipients. The resource providers are the funders, and if you're a public sector PBE, then often your revenue is coming from central government, or if you're in local government, from ratepayers. If you're in the sector, then you can have a variety of funding streams. Service recipients, that's a really new thing for a framework to have that in, but it is saying that service recipients have an interest in the service performance reporting of an entity, and also its financial performance. The qualitative characteristics are very similar to the current framework, and they're even closer to the most recent International Accounting Standards Framework, which applies to for-profit entities. So although this is a new framework for PBEs, the IASB, the for-profit body, has also been revising its framework in phases, and the qualitative characteristics sections are very similar. The elements are what you'd come to expect, the assets, liabilities. However, it does also talk about outputs and outcomes. There is a brief mention about the possibility of having other resources and other obligations, being things that do not meet the definition of assets or liabilities. At present, that possibility hasn't flowed through to any standards. The NZASB will be closely monitoring any international developments in that area, so really at this stage it's just something to be aware of. There are chapters on recognition and measurement, presentation. I think probably most of the new material is in the chapters on measurement and presentation, and that the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board spent a long time trying to provide a discussion of what it regards as the measurement basis that might be appropriate for public sector entities. And in New Zealand, we've retained all that discussion for PBEs. And I say that that's new material because if you look at the current IASB framework for for-profit entities, it doesn't really have much on measurement, and it has even less on presentation. The NZASB also developed quite a bit of new material about presentation. Because it's new material, it is quite high level. It uses the terms display and disclosure. So it talks about display for when you're presenting things in the body of a financial statement, and disclosure for the notes or for the supporting information. So that's just a quick overview of that conceptual framework that's been issued, but as I said earlier, it does it did underlie the development of the ED. So if you want further information about if you're trying to track down that new conceptual framework, it's available on our ED. And if you want to track down the documents that we've been talking about in this webinar, they're also available on our website. And there's a section now for keeping up to date, and there's quick links that you might find useful for quickly getting to what you want. So at this stage, we've run through all the slides, and I'm delighted how many people have been able to join us today. I'm sorry we haven't been able to have some face-to-face interaction, but we might meet up in other venues, and we'll be interested in hearing your comments here. But please, if you've got views on this exposure draft, the board would be really interested. And even if you look at it and think these are high-level principles, they're okay, I can live with this, please do drop us a line, because the board needs to be aware of the breadth of opinion and also the depth of opinion. So how many people are reasonably comfortable with it, or what are the areas where you think the board needs to do more work or consult more widely. So we really would welcome that feedback. Now at this stage we had allowed some time for questions, but you've been an extremely quiet lot, and at this stage we don't have any questions. So you can always feed questions through to us after this session if you want, or make contact with us. So once again, sorry, just have one more thing. We do also have the slides. The slide pack for this webinar is available on the website if you want to go back and look at some of the things that we've been talking about. So to wrap up the session, very much for your time. We do appreciate it. We appreciate your interest in this topic, and we look forward to hearing from you. And we'll take a break now. Those people that are enrolled for the second webinar, that starts a separate link for that webinar. So thanks everyone, and have a great day.